Welcome to On the Horizon, where our vision meets the ground. Join me, Levi Hall, as we discuss how our local cooperative can help with your success. Welcome to another episode of On the Horizon. This week's guest is Jason Schwantz. Jason is a senior vice president at CHS Inc. So one of the major goals that we had with this podcast was to bring conversations to our member owners that were with people that were exclusive or hard to get a hold of, and people that you don't just run into on the street. Jason's position within CHS, he reports to Darren Hunhoff, who runs the entire energy division for CHS. Darren reports to Jay Debertine, who is the CEO of CHS. So this is someone really high up on the pecking order of CHS, 10,000 plus employees. And he's up there with a seat at one of the really high up tables. Jason gives us a great feel for the entire energy team at CHS. And he talks about his transition throughout the company over time. And it all stems back to his roots as a farmer and a dairy farmer and corn and soybean farmer in southern Minnesota. Jason's a phenomenal guy. I have nothing but good things to say about Jason. My wife, who is my ultimate character reference for people, loves Jason Schwantz. So just can't say enough great things about Jason and his family. But him taking an hour out of his time to come on this podcast is just, he believes in what we're doing here. He believes in Horizon Resources, and he is just really excited to come share his knowledge with you, the member owner. So enjoy this episode. I know you will.
In the heart of North Dakota, where the Yellowstone meets the Missouri, lies a story that has never been fully told. This is where our journey began. In 1929, a group of farmers saw the potential of this land and decided to build something lasting. They created a cooperative where the spirit of the West meets modern ingenuity. From our humble beginnings, with just 110 founding members, we grew alongside the community. Our first service station in 1936 was more than a place to fuel up. It was a symbol of progress and a promise of better things to come. Through the decades, our cooperative evolved, marking key milestones along the way. Each step forward, each innovation, was driven by a commitment to our members and our community. Our strength has always come from the land and the people who work it. The sweat of our brows, the calluses on our hands. They are the foundation of Horizon Resources. Today, Horizon Resources stands as a beacon of innovation and community support. Our operations span essential sectors, driven by technology and a commitment to excellence in the services we provide. From providing top-quality fuel to boosting crop yields with advanced agronomy solutions, we are the backbone of our community. We deliver the fuel that powers your day, the grain marketing that maximizes your return, and the agronomy expertise that nurtures your land, all with the emblem of Horizon Resources as our guarantee. Our commitment to technological innovation means we bring the latest advancements directly to your fields, maximizing yields and profitability. Over the years, we've given back over $250,000 to local causes, supporting everything from 4-H, rural emergency services, youth sports, and more. Our commitment extends beyond our products to the heart of what makes our community great. At Horizon Resources, we're more than a team, we're a family. We invest in our people, offering opportunities for growth and a supportive work environment. As we look to the future, Horizon Resources remains committed to innovation, community, and the success of our members. Join us and be part of a story that continues to unfold. Horizon Resources, where tradition meets progress, and together, we forge a path forward.
Welcome back to another episode of On the Horizon. This week's guest, we have a special guest from CHS Inc., Jason Schwantz. Jason, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Greatly appreciated. And really, this is my first podcast, so this is a new venture for me, but I'm excited about it.
Hey, awesome. We love having newbies. We were definitely newbies, and we still are newbies at setting this thing up. And it's been a lot of fun and a great adventure. So before we get into a lot of the topics that we've kind of talked about ahead of time, why don't you just give me a little bit of your background and introduce yourself to our audience?
Not a problem. So I am Jason Schwantz. I am the Senior Vice President of our Energy Go-to-Market, which would include everything from refined fuels, propane, and lubricants. I live in River Falls, Wisconsin, and work out of Emerald Grove Heights, which is our current headquarters for CHS. I have quite a different background. I grew up in Plainview, Minnesota, on 50-cow dairy farm. We had about 300 acres that we ran of corn, soybean, and alfalfa, and everything was based around those cows, including my entire youth life. We were big 4-H and FFA people. I would go to the county fair, show cattle every single year. I always looked forward to it. Wabasha County is the county that I grew up in. On the river, it was kind of nice to get out of Plainview, go down there, show some cattle, but really had a lot of fun doing that growing up on a farm. I learned what hard work was really quickly because I'd get up and milk cows before I went to school. I'd hustle home sometimes after school to do the same thing. But then yet, too, I played a lot of sports. So my dad was actually Minnesota Gopher football player in his youth time. So as much as I would love to push my dad around, that would not happen. He was a defensive lineman, so he was one big dude and played in 2 Rose Bowls. That's mine and his claim to fame. He is no longer with us. He passed away, but I still claim, I love talking about my father just because he has kind of a neat story and different background, but really cool. So.
Yeah, awesome. So Inver Grove Heights, which you mentioned, is the headquarters for CHS Inc., that is on the southeast side of, St. Paul. And then where was your home from where you work now?
Yep. Highway 52 goes straight by the office here. If you took that straight down towards Rochester and veered off on Highway 14 on a little town called Orinoco, you would run right into Plainview. It's about an hour and 20 minutes from the office. That is what allows me actually to have a little side gig hobby. I still own that farm. As I said, my father passed away. My mom lives on the farm. She sold it to me on a contract for deed. And I farm part-time corn and soybeans on the side. No more dairy cattle. That's a lot of work. And for a guy that has a job in the cities and wants to stay connected, corn and soybeans keep me as connected as I need to be. That's a little easier than running a dairy farm. And I love cows and dairy farming, but for a guy that has a regular job, it was really fun. I literally love farming. I love getting out in the tractor. People ask me if I'm green or red. Well, I'm both. I'm one of those guys that doesn't care. I have 2 green ones and 1 red one. The red one is the fanciest one with GPS and all that. So it's much easier to plant nowadays than it used to be, but I seriously love remembering where I came from, and just that ag background really has done me a lot in my career. Quite frankly, I love agriculture. I love dealing with the people, farmers, ranchers. I just like finding out how people do things differently in different areas of the country. And my job here has allowed me to figure a lot of that out, which I really love. Ranching is much different than farming in the Midwest, and just learning like irrigation, I can tell kind of a funny story. When I was in college, I went to work for a dairy farmer up in River Falls. And one of the first jobs he said is, Jason, we're going to go pick rocks. And I'm like, okay, we picking them out of the ditch or where are we picking these rocks from? He goes, no, we're picking them out of the field. And I'm like, where I grew up, I admit we have 6 feet of really dark, heavy black topsoil. And I had never picked rock in my life. I didn't even know what it was. So that's how cultured I was, I guess, at that time. So
if you ever want more practice of it, I'm sure we could get some of our guys to volunteer rock picker for you.
Quite frankly, we'll probably pass on that one because I really like the heavy top black soil that you don't have to pick rock out of.
Yeah, you're pretty spoiled there. That's pretty awesome. Yeah, and we've seen such a big shift on the cattle side that you talked about a little bit too. I mean, the 50 head dairies, they used to be, every county had a handful of them, especially in Minnesota. You saw quite a few. But even around my place, I remember our neighbor growing up had around 50 dairy cows too. And if you don't have 500, you're really not in that dairy game.
That is for sure the truth. I live on 247 is where my farm is. I shouldn't say I live there. My mom lives there. But quite frankly, that used to just be dairy herd after dairy herd after dairy herd. Now there's one dairy herd that has 1,200 cows. And I think all the neighbors probably sold most of their cows to the one farmer who still does it. But you're right. That game has totally changed. And I bet, when I went to the county fair, there was, 100 different families that raised, dairy cattle. And quite frankly, now I think I've been to the county fair and some of the families that I showed against are still there, but it is really, really thinned out and just a lot less numbers. I don't think cattle numbers are less. I think it's just the people doing it, like you said, have gotten, quite frankly, the lot bigger farms. And I know like our area is still smaller when you're talking 1,200. You go out to western Minnesota and some of those and you're talking 10,000, cow herds and things like that. It's just a different game.
Yeah. So once you graduated high school, Jason, where did you end up going for college?
So after I graduated from Plainview, yes, I did graduate. Then I went to the University of Wisconsin River Falls, and it was an ag school. I always joke with people, I have an animal science major, a food science minor with a dairy emphasis that I am putting to good use in the oil business, taking dead animals out of the ground and making it into fuel and selling to people. River Falls is actually still where I live. I met my wife there. We have 4 kids, 2 boys, 2 girls, and it is about 30 minutes from the office just across the border in Wisconsin. One of the reasons I moved there, my wife is from there. She pretty much gave me an ultimatum. If you want to get married, we're living here in Wisconsin. I said, okay. For us, that's a big rivalry here, Minnesota, Wisconsin, but I have adapted fairly well to living there. And school was a blast there. It was a smaller college, about 4,500 people, with a really specialized in 2 things, teaching and agriculture. And the agriculture school was 2,500 of those 4,500 students. So it was really a good place for me to go to school. Like I said, I really focused on what I grew up with, animal science. And quite frankly, paths can take you down, different paths take you different places. My major, I always joke with people. People are like, Jason, what do you do? I said, I work in the oil business. And they're like, isn't your major animal science? I'm like, yes, it was.
Yeah. When I was at North Dakota State, I was in a group called the Bison Ambassadors, and they were very heavily involved with the Alumni Association. And so one of the big events that we would help with was we would deal with this Bison Bitters Bowl where a bunch of the really big alumni that were very successful would come in. And one of my favorite things is I would always ask them, what was your major while you were here? And the amount of animal science degrees that I talked to that did nothing related to animal science, but they became very successful people. And to me, it's kind of to do an animal science degree, typically you're somebody that comes from a farm ranch background and you have that work ethic instilled in you, and you can take that and apply that to any industry you want, and you're going to be successful.
I couldn't agree with you more. My upbringing and my mother and father shaped me into what I am today. And like you said, that work ethic out of people that grow up in that rural community with that farming background is just a different thing. Like I said, I milked cows before I went to school. One of the jobs I hated most was changing silo and loader doors when you had to climb up there. I absolutely despised it, but you had to do it, once a week, just learning how to work, and I think too, that rural life leads to a very good family life. You do everything together. Now, vacation isn't something we did very often, but working together and I think, too, one of the things my mom and dad instilled in me, too, was that kind of county fair, that FFA, 4-H, not only did I learn how to work, but I learned how to deal with people and make sure, that I had good communication skills. Just because you can work hard is a great thing, but being able to work hard and being able to talk to people and converse back and forth, that's probably what led me down the sales path, even though I have that animal science major in the oil business. So.
Yeah. So you You talked about the county fair being the vacation of the dairy farmer, and I think that's one of the truest statements. But so then you graduate from River Falls, and talk about how your career unfolded after that.
Yep. So one of my roommates was Keith Nugent, and his dad owned a business in Ellsworth, Wisconsin, which was called Dyson Nugent Feed Mill Fertilizer Plant. I got an internship there my junior year, and quite frankly, I loved working there. It was the closest thing I could get to working on the farm, but not actually being there, because you're working with farmers all the time. And it was an independent feed mill fertilizer plant, and there was a cooperative in town in Ellsworth too. And quite frankly, the two had a great working relationship. It was awesome, but literally we'd share back and forth. But I really liked just, I was the feed mill manager. It was my first job out of school. So I just learned to make feed for people, deal with people. We were selling feed, but then also at the same time, they had this fertilizer business. So you kind of became a jack of all trades. I was a chemical mixer when I wasn't running the feed mill and doing things like that, delivering fertilizer to people, delivering seed. You really became a jack of all trades in there. But that was my first job out of school, and I did that for 3 or 4 years. Then, quite frankly, my mother got sick, and she had a kidney transplant. And quite frankly, my dad needed help, so I decided to leave my job at Dyson Nugent and go home and help my dad for 6 months. I said, Dad, you need to be with Mom. You can do this. I will take, these 6 months off. I said, I'm going to be looking for a different job, but I'll help you out so you can spend more time with Mom and make sure that she heals up. One of the toughest decisions I made, but one of the better decisions I made. And quite frankly, in the end of my mom healing up, I found a job at what then was Harvest States. And their office was at the old state fairgrounds in Minnesota on the corner of Snelling and Larpenteur. So I became a grain trader for my first few years there. I started out in the specialties products. So I traded a lot of sunflowers and canola. I traded some barley, and in the end, I was a wheat trader. Well, I got this idea. I knew some people in energy, and they're like, Jason, do you want to try something different? And CHS became that because Cenex and Harvest States merged, and the office moved from that Larpenteur Snelling location down to where we currently are in Inver Grove Heights. And I became a pricer for the area. So if you had any pricing complaints from about 20 years ago, I was the person you could talk to, maybe 25 years ago. So I was pricing that Laurel watershed area. It was a different job for me, but I really liked it. I enjoyed the business. And it was still in that cooperative system, working people in those rural markets. And, one of the big things we do here is promote diesel fuel, our premium diesel fuel. That's what we're really good at selling. I did that for a number of years after grain trading.
Would that have been your first interaction with Jeff Watts and Jeff Wagner in that role? Would that kind of been your Horizon Resources introduction then? Or what did that kind of happen? Is that still down the road?
Nope, that would have been my first introduction to them when I was a pricing guy. Quite frankly, we worked really close with the salespeople.
Yeah, I can't imagine either of them ever complaining about prices. I'm sure you guys were always the cheapest and everything was great.
Yes, we never, ever got one complaint out of Mr. Watts at all. He would be in my ear quite a bit, but quite frankly, in those days, we were trying to grow the business. The Bakken hadn't taken off yet. And quite frankly, our Lower refinery, we were long gasoline and some diesel fuel. So we were working with them, pricing things, doing that. From there, I went into the sales side and got to deal with them even more. Probably that's what really started us off with your company on this growth pattern. And as it evolved, I kept moving up. They kept getting bigger and bigger. I think they were just probably the co-op at Williston at that time. I don't even think it had been called Horizon Resources quite yet.
Farmers Union Oil of Williston.
Fired them. And they were in growth mode. And Jeff Watts, quite frankly, was fun to deal with. He was an aggressive guy. I've never seen anybody that knows how to network like Mr. Watts. He knows everyone and everything that goes on out there. It was really good. So when I got into the sales, quite frankly, I was working the sales of that Laurel watershed, worked with them a lot. Quite frankly, then the Bakken came along and I moved a couple different jobs. Then I went over to propane for a while. I became our national sales director for propane, came back to fuels. Then I ended up getting all of the Laurel watershed operations, the sales, everything, the whole works along the chain, along with our Senex zip trip sites. Those also reported into me, which were kind of out in the west. Only reason we had them is we needed to move more gas. But then the Bakken came along and really exploded, and so did, quite frankly, Horizon Resources growth pattern. I mean, they were right in the heart of it, and Jeff Watts, being the aggressive go-getter he is, really grew that business just like crazy, and just hand in hand, we grew with them. And quite frankly, I moved a couple different jobs. I went into lubricants then. So I ran our lubricants department. Then I came back, ran the refined fuels. Quite frankly, all of refined fuels reported into me except for the sales part. And that's when I got this last job. Now I am in charge of, quite frankly, what we call go-to-market for energy, which is the sales of refined fuels, propane, and lubricants. But I have been on this growth pattern with Horizon Resources and Jeff, quite frankly, for 20, 25 years.
Yeah.
And it's been just nothing but a fun ride. You know, have we had our ups and downs, and business has gone up and down, and you see different things happen like COVID and, quite frankly, the Bakken boom. You know, one was just a positive growth pattern, you know, with the Bakken boom. But then you have COVID, which was just sunk things as quickly as it could. And one of my weird memories from COVID was actually when crude oil got to be, there wasn't a price for crude oil. You had to pay people to take crude oil because it traded negative. Yeah. And then you're like, is that even possible? We didn't even know. Nobody had ever seen that before. Yeah. You were paying people to take your crude.
I remember that day distinctly because I was sitting in the office. I was at Beach Co-op at that time. And I remember just sitting there, and we didn't trade crude, but it was spring wheat was usually the front board for me. And I had switched that day, and I was just watching crude, and we had cleared through ADM at the time. And I called ADM and I said, can this thing go negative? And these professional brokers said, we don't know, but we're about to find out. And they ended up being yes.
It was crazy. I had never seen anything like that. You know, nobody ever had. You know, there was rough times in oil markets, but quite frankly, nobody knew what was going to happen. And it traded negative for a period of time, and it was just a different deal. Nobody had ever seen anything like that. So I do admit I have been around long enough to see a lot of different things, and that was one of the craziest things I had ever seen.
Well, that's a good transition, Jason, into the operations that CHS runs, because I want to talk a little bit about how we get raw crude turned into diesel fuel in a tank out here in Williston, North Dakota, or surrounding area. So let's talk a little bit about where you source your crude from. Let's start at the beginning of the chain and why you source it there. My assumption always was that Bakken crude would make so much sense because you would have less freight, or, it's so close by. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yep. So I can go back, Laurel, Montana. We have our refinery out there that runs currently about 65,000 barrels a day of crude oil. And where does that crude come from? So right now, a lot of that crude comes from two sources. Wyoming and Montana, there's quite a few wells that have been around for a long time. That comprises, quite frankly, about 10% of our volumes. But the majority, 90 plus, comes from Canada. And you're going to be like, Jason, why does it come from Canada? Well, quite frankly, the pipelines are set up and have been set up to come into those Laurel Billings refineries for an awful long time. Canada has a lot of crude oil, and it's a heavy sour crude oil. What does heavy sour mean? Heavy sour means it's really laden with sulfur, which government regulations means you have to take that sulfur out of there. But Canadian crude has some really good properties, and one, it makes a lot of diesel fuel. It also trades at a discount to what is called WTI, or West Texas Intermediate, which pretty much all the rest of the crude in the U.S. is traded off of, including Bakken crude. Well, if you can get what traditionally is a 15-cent discount off of your crude, you can, save a lot. The other thing is it helps you price-wise, but it is built, those terminals and those pipelines are already built up to get that product to our refinery. Now, do we run any Bakken? We have run some Bakken in the past, but there is a problem with Bakken crude. If you look at it, the Bakken is, quite frankly, to the east of our refinery. And those pipelines are set up to go to the eastern refiners, the one in Minnesota, Koch, Marathon. And then they have the pipelines that take it down to Chicago. There's also the pipelines that take it down to Cushing. So there's a lot of product that goes to the east that does not have pipelines that are tied into our refinery. In order for us to get Bakken crude over there, we have to really take it by rail, is usually how it would get over there. So we do run some small amounts from time to time, but Bakken crude is also a crude that is really, quite frankly, gas rich. So our customers really want the diesel fuel, and that's why we run that heavy Canadian sour. Is one, it trades at a discount. Our pipes are already set up, so the logistics make it cheaper that way on top of it too, and it yields a lot of diesel fuel.
So one of the things you talked about there was railing that Bakken crude back, because pipelines are really a one-way street. It's not, you can't pull it back necessarily. And so to put it on that rail, I think about what we saw in 2012, 2013 was kind of the peak of the rail market, where so much of the crude from the Bakken was getting moved on rail that it boogered up the entire BNSF, and it changed freight values. You know, if you're a listener of this podcast and you've gone back and listened to the episode with Jordan Sinclair, we talked really briefly about freight values and how those are set. And essentially there's an auction, and what happens is when there's a large amount of a product that suddenly appears, much like the Bakken crude did, and they had to move it, the oil companies could afford to move at higher prices than, say, grain companies. So we saw dollars per bushel being charged for the freight. The highest I ever saw was $7,000 or $7,500 per car. So per car on 110 cars. I mean, that is a huge bill, $7 to $8 million that somebody was willing to pay for that freight. So this is something that, it might work occasionally if freight is priced right and stuff, but you look around here now and all these oil loading loops that are built here and cost, some of these over $100 million. A lot of them are collecting cobwebs, and that's about it.
Yep. And quite frankly, rail is a lot more expensive than moving things by pipe. And when the Bakken exploded, production was coming online, but you couldn't keep up to the production that was coming online. So rail was where they had to turn to move that product out. So a lot of that product moved by rail. Over time, pipelines are getting built, gathering places are getting built. So the need for rail has lessened. And like you said, it spiked the price rail freight, which quite frankly threw the whole market, especially commodities, into a tizzy. And quite frankly, if you're competing with grain versus oil, quite frankly, price-wise, oil is going to win in that situation, and it did. And that's where a lot of the cars went, and quite frankly, these rail rates went ballistic. Over time, people have built pipelines out of the Bakken in order to take product out of there. The cheapest, safest way to energy products is via pipelines. Now, it's not easy getting new ones built with regulation, but a lot of those pipes, we're getting connected in. You always hear about, how are these pipelines going to affect things? But it's really the cheapest, most efficient, safest way to move things. And that's one of the reasons we don't use as much Bakken crude as people would probably think, because it looks like we're right out in the middle of it. But quite frankly, it's to the east. The pipes have been built to go to the east. And like you said, they don't go both ways. So we're further out there. Those Canadian pipelines are already there. It's just supply and demand thing, along with an infrastructure thing that's built out there. That infrastructure was already built from Canada. And quite frankly, there are price advantages to Canadian crude too. And it produces more. There's things like that. We're not, we would love to use more Bakken crude, but quite frankly, it's got to fit into your slate. There's got to be a reasonable means to get it there. And rail is not the most efficient, cost-effective way to move it there. So for us to keep, quite frankly, the cooperatives' prices down and make sure prices are where they need to be, these are the things that we have to do that.
Well, I think that that's a great point, because when you're looking at the people that we compete with here at our gas station or one of our 5 gas stations, when there's a gas station across the road that's 5 cents per gallon cheaper, that can easily come from something as simple as, how did you source and your raw crude? How was it brought to your location? Because that all trickles down into that price.
It does. And one of the things that keeps us a cost-efficient supplier is that, quite frankly, cheaper Canadian crude. And I'll compare it to grain. It's just a basis level is what it is. If you have $3.10 corn and your basis is 10 under, you're paying $3. Well, if crude is $75 and the discount for Canadian sour is $15 under, you have $60 crude. It's exactly like grain trading, and that's what makes it work, is that free trade market. We have a refinery in McPherson, Kansas, too, and we take a lot of our crude comes out of Kansas there because they have a lot of older wells, but then we get a lot of, quite frankly, Canadian crude down there and other types of crudes down there at that refinery also. And quite frankly, we're looking for the best blends to make us competitive in that marketplace so we can keep, quite frankly, our cooperatives competitive too.
Absolutely. So once that crude comes from the tar sands of Canada and comes down, it hits Laurel, Montana, where you guys have your refinery. What happens next?
Yep. So we have some gathering sites that we've built in order to stage up some crude that would come from Canada. Then it would be piped into our refinery. So once it's piped into our refinery, quite frankly, we operate on what's called a 2-1-1 crack. There's a 5-3-2 crack, which is a Texas kind of crack. And that's a little different because it's sweet crude. So you're taking 5 barrels of crude oil, you're getting 3 of gas, 2 of distillate, and 1 of other products. Now, at CHS in Laurel, we run at a 2-1-1 crack. So there's 2 barrels of crude gets you 1 barrel of gas, 1 barrel of diesel. So essentially, our refinery is 50-50 on that, gas and diesel. That's a really high ratio towards diesel, and I think we're getting to, but they might even tweak it past that. But what do we do with that then? Goes through the refining process. Lots of heat, lots of steam, lots of pressure. You have cokers to squeeze every ounce of product out of there. In the old days, we didn't have a coker, and we produced a lot of asphalt. So that asphalt had valuable product in it, and CHS invested in that coker, which essentially is a big drum where you apply pressure and heat to the product to squeeze every last ounce of gas and diesel fuel out of it. And you get a leftover product called coke, which is used for burning for heat. It's almost a similar to coal product, but that's sold off, usually goes to the West Coast. But then you're left basically with essentially 3 products. You have gas, distillate, and asphalt. There would be some sulfur and some other products left over too, but the main 3 would be gas, distillate, asphalt. So that gas and diesel is shipped in pipes out of Laurel, comes over to Glendive, goes to Minot, goes to Fargo, and we service our customers out of that. How fast does that pipeline move product? 5 to 7 miles an hour. Everybody, I always use that as one of my trivia questions when I ask people, because they're like, Jason, how fast does it move in there? 20, 30, 50 miles an hour. I'm like, nope, it's usually somewhere between 5 and 7 miles an hour. It inches along. Now, gas and diesel are both shipped in the same exact pipe also. And that's kind of an eye-opener for people too. But it's shipped in there. Quite frankly, they put what's called a pig in the line to separate it. So there's this styrofoam, looks like a bullet, that goes in there and keeps the gas and distillate separated. But at times, there will be what's called transmix. So when it comes out of the refinery, goes into our pipe, goes to the Glendive terminal, quite frankly, there's a computer system that knows exactly when to turn those valves on and off in the gas and distillate tanks. And there's also a slop tank where, quite frankly, what's called transmix, where some of the 2 products mix together, that goes into a different tank, goes back to the refinery, gets re-refined. But that's how your product goes from Canada, Canadian crude, goes to the refinery, goes through refining process, the 2-1-1 crack, gets shipped out of the pipes, goes into the terminals, and from there you get your diesel, your gas, your number 1, you get all your products. And then the trucks come in, pull out of there, whether it's semi-trucks, usually bringing it out. And then a lot of times you'll take it to plants that you have, storage facilities you have, then off to a truck and off to the farm or off to the station it goes.
So where does the dye get added for the dyed diesel?
So dyed diesel is right in the line there. When you go to your menu to select off the computer, if you select dyed diesel, quite frankly, there's an injector right at the line that puts it into the diesel fuel. So you don't have that essentially lower taxed item on there. You have clear, dyed, and quite frankly, the dyeing happens right in line, right at the terminal as you choose it.
Sure. So the terminals that come out of the Laurel network. So when you go east out of Laurel, the first one is Glendive, correct?
That is correct.
And then it goes up to Minot. The pipeline actually comes underneath Williston or around the Williston area.
Yes, sir.
Follows Highway 2 over. There's a terminal over in Minot. It's just on the west side of Minot. And then
that's correct.
Down in Fargo. Is there one in between Fargo and Minot?
There's not. Okay. Not a terminal.
And then
so there is. I should say. Oh, go ahead.
Does the pipeline terminate in?
So essentially, what happens there? So it goes from Laurel to Glendive, which is our terminal, to Minot, which is our terminal. There is a tank in between called Prosper, where we ship off and go to another New Star pipeline and can get to Minnesota. But then the majority goes into Fargo, and there's Fargo and Grand Forks. Fargo and Grand Forks are terminals that are owned by a different company, which was called Magellan, has been bought out by a company called One Oak. And those are just people that run terminals. That is the end of the line, essentially, for us is Fargo and Grand Forks. That's as far as our product can get to the east. Now, we can also ship to the west, and we do. We have a deal with essentially Conoco, and essentially we ship into their line, and product can go over to the Rocky Mountains. So we ship a certain amount of our product, which then can go from Laurel. It can go over to Missoula, even into Spokane, Hilliard area, and Great Falls. There's a number of terminals we can get to the west. We do not ship nearly as much to the west as we do to the east, and part of that is because of the Bakken, quite frankly, North Dakota's demand that we have over there, with that demand being that high, and quite frankly, those are our terminals too in Glendive and Minot.
Sure. Yeah, you want to feed your own assets.
We want to feed our own assets, and Montana, North Dakota, both really, really strong cooperative areas that we have a lot of business. But if you look at it, our biggest terminal in the system, I believe, is Minot. The second biggest one, I think, is Fargo, and the third biggest terminal in the system is Glendive. So in that pipeline of ours, of our network, if you think about it, including our McPherson refinery, the three biggest terminals just so happen to be on our own pipeline.
So when, let's say there's a co-op down in Wyoming or something like that, is there easiest way to get product to bring a truck up to Laurel, or is there a pipe that goes south as well?
There is a pipe that also goes south and goes into Wyoming, and quite frankly can meet up down in Rapid City, Sturgis area, and then could go down to Denver. So we do have the ability to ship product from Laurel all the way to Denver if we wanted to. And we do ship some down there. Again, it's a smaller amount because we have that big sucking sound in North Dakota, that demand sound there. But we do ship into the Denver market. And quite frankly, we need those options, one, to feed our customers, and two, just, to make sure gasoline demand had been on the increase forever and ever. And then we saw COVID hit and it started to inch downward. So we have to make sure that we can supply all of this distillate demand. But quite frankly, we have to move the gasoline too, and we have to have those different outlets. One advantage we have at our refinery, I think you've pointed out here pretty well, is we can go to the west over to Missoula, Hilliard. We can go to the east all the way over to Fargo, and we can go to the south down to Denver if we needed to. It's just all those options really help provide the market a good supply and, quite frankly, some options on where to move our gasoline.
Yeah, well, and I was thinking about Denver and Fargo. Those are really gasoline-heavy demand areas, maybe less diesel demand. I mean, Denver, they've got quite a bit of commercial truck traffic through there still. But the other wild card that we haven't talked about yet, Jason, electric vehicles. I know that it's something that every conference and convention with you guys that I go to, it's something that gets talked about. Do you have any feel, is this going to change what CHS does with a Laurel refinery or McPherson or any of those? Or is this something that you guys don't think will affect your line of business?
No, I think if you look at it, we look at those electric vehicles, they're not going away. Quite frankly, though, the electric vehicles have really taken off more so on the coasts and specifically the West Coast. If you look at that, California has really incented for the electric vehicles. They're selling more than anyone on those. I believe electric vehicles are going to be a piece of the equation. I think fossil fuels are going to be a piece of the equation. So I think your strong refiners are going to survive. Quite frankly, some of the fringe refineries are going to look at other options. You hear a lot about renewable diesel fuel, where you're taking soybean oil and making diesel fuel out of it. I think that's going to get popular. You've seen a number of fossil fuel refineries turn over to that. But I will say there are pitfalls. If you look at California, California has all these electric vehicles and didn't figure out what to do with the tax. So what pays for the roads? Well, gas tax does. They've sold so many electric vehicles without a tax on it. They have a $5 billion shortfall in their taxes for building roads in California. So they figured out, hey, we've got to figure out a way to charge these electric vehicles taxed. So they're looking at a mileage tax to make up some of that difference. I think these are all things people are going to have to take into account. If you look at electric vehicles, quite frankly, they serve a purpose. I think they're more, quite frankly, of a grocery getter, or they need to run a certain route. They're going to be more popular in the bigger cities than they probably are in the rural markets. And I think the other thing is the charging infrastructure is probably built up in those bigger cities more so than it is in the rural markets. I don't think it's anything that's going to go away, but I think it's going to be a piece together type of a supply scenario where you have a piece of it's going to be refined fuels, a piece of it's going to be some renewable fuel things that are coming at people. And then you're going to have a part of the market that's electric.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I don't think that we're going to see, our 700 horsepower tractors going electric anytime soon. But if you're the Sunday driver that lives in Phoenix or Dallas, Texas, or somewhere that's a warm climate especially, and you're the little old lady that just wants to go to church and back or go to the grocery store and back, I think one of those could be a great solution for you. To me, up here in the cold, the battery makes me a little nervous. I certainly wouldn't be buying one for my family, but I think that there's definitely some hybrid options that have come along that have improved and allowed people to stretch that tank a little bit farther. So yeah, it's definitely, I agree with you. It's part of the market that's not going away.
I think you hit it right on the head there. I'm a big believer in the hybrid type vehicles. If you look at them, not necessarily the plug-in hybrids, but I think if you look at it, hybrid vehicles are going to get better mileage, which is going to be pushed more and more. I do not see electric, quite frankly, myself coming to the agricultural sector at all. I don't understand how you could really make that work. When people want to go in the springtime, they're not going to have the patience to sit around and plug their tractor in and wait 4 or 5 hours, and I don't even know if something with that much horsepower is probably going to take longer than 4 or 5 hours to charge. I just don't see that being a viable option. John Deere and some of those have tried it. I think John Deere actually gave up on it because they're like, this doesn't have any practical use for us. So they've actually gone away from it, and they're like, hey, we're going to focus on what we're good at. And I just think that sector, diesel fuel especially, going to be important there because that's what that agricultural tractors, combine sector runs on.
Yeah. So I want to jump back towards our conversation here a little bit. So we talked about the pipeline getting out to those terminals. So now from the terminal, it kind of leaves your guys' hands. CHS is really not involved with it anymore. The local co-ops are more so who take ownership of that fuel at that time. Can you talk a little bit about what happens once it leaves that terminal and we get it out to that farm? How does that process work?
Yep. So essentially co-ops will come in. They have semi with a carded driver who's been trained on safety in order to take that product out of there. So they'll card in under their cooperative's name, get a load of fuel. Some of them will take that a lot of the farmers are getting bigger now where they can take an entire transport. So that transport will come in, go directly to the farm, and drop the entire semi off at a farm if they have a big enough tank. I don't think it's probably the majority yet, but could be in the future. But a lot of what happens is that same driver comes in, cards in, gets a semi load, and probably has 3 different sections and gets maybe some premium gas, some regular gas, and the rest of it he gets diesel fuel. And he goes to his cooperative and drops it off at their tank farm, which a lot of people have, and he puts it in there. From there, you'll see what's known as a tank wagon or a smaller truck, usually a tandem axle, some places bigger than that, will come in and, quite frankly, deliver to the farmer those smaller amounts that they need to keep their tanks full. A lot of people monitor tanks now, and you see a lot of that going on. So like at your cooperative, you're probably getting notifications, hey, Farmer Jim Smith over here, the monitor's going off, getting to a lower level, needs some fuel. I think technology is going to play a bigger and bigger role in this. I think you're going to see more and more of that tank monitoring. Tank monitors used to be expensive. Now they've gotten into mass production where those have come down. And I just think you're going to see a lot more of that. I will say this, we all worry about fuel costs, but if you ever look in the ag cycle of growing things, quite frankly, diesel fuel is not a very big cost compared relative to seed, fertilizer, application, things like that. And I think you're going to see more people like that monitoring of the tanks because they just realize, hey, I need it there when I need it. And I really don't want to, be bothered with it other than having my product there on time when I need it. And it's really become the wave, I think, of the future. I think you're going to see more and more of that monitoring and, quite frankly, technology playing its part as it always does in all of our lives, even today. I think you're going to see more and more of that. Once you get it to the farmer's tank, then quite frankly, the bill comes back to the cooperative. Cooperative, bills it out. We've billed the cooperative out for their product. And quite frankly, as you know, then you see what the earnings are at the end of the year. If it comes up to a good positive, then we pay you back some patronage. And quite frankly, the cooperatives handle it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your comment about the fuel being such a small percentage of the inputs is spot on. I actually knew a guy that farms down in the southeast corner of the state, and his comment was, I love high fuel prices because that typically means that commodity prices have bounced back too. He said, really, for my cost of production, I'm more worried about my fertilizer prices, my ag chem prices. Those are the big costs of production. The diesel fuel is not where I'm going to start splitting hairs.
No, it's a really temperamental thing. I'll say this, everybody gets touchy, especially the consumer when it comes to gas prices. But if you look at it really relative to what a farmer has for costs, and I'm one of them, diesel fuel, I'm not saying it's not a cost. It's there, and we want to get people the best prices. But relative to what the other things you're spending on, it's really, really a small piece of that pie.
So let's talk a little bit really quickly about how the prices are set, Jason. So you guys buy, you referenced that hypothetical $60 for the Canadian crude. Talk a little bit about how that process is, and you don't have to get down into the nitty gritties and quarter of cents into how you're getting it out there, but just give us a little feel for how those prices are.
It very, very similar to the ag business and the grain business, and I'll compare it to that. Essentially, there's the Chicago Board of Trade for grain. Well, on fuels, there's the NYMEX. And quite frankly, the NYMEX is a liquid market where things are trading all the time. So that's what really sets the price, sets the market for the cost of fuel. Then you get out to your areas and you have a basis level on that fuel, just like you would on your grain. And quite frankly, the further away you get from the refinery, well, those basis levels tend to get, it costs more to get it out there. So you're going to need more for it. The closer in you are, just quite frankly, the opposite. But that's basically how the price is set. It's set off the market. It's not set off of what it costs us or anything like that. It's set just like the grain prices. What is the market on that day? And quite frankly, there's a number of factors that go into it. We have basis levels just like anybody else, but it trades off of that NYMEX just like grain trades off the Chicago Board of Trade. And then you have your basis levels to go from there via the terminals.
Right on. It's really not that complex. We try and be as competitive with our pricing. I try and pay as much as I can on the grain side. Our energy team tries to get it as cheap as they can. We are all still working for that member owner. Mm-hmm. We want the farmers to be as successful as possible because they're doing business with Horizon Resources. No different than any of the other co-ops out there.
No, I couldn't agree more. Quite frankly, we appreciate all of your business. We appreciate, our producer growers out there, the owners, The system is a wonderful system. I've been in it for 30 some years. I think I'm embarrassed to say now, but I'm getting up there in age. People used to refer to me as the kid. I wish that was still the case, but I'm not a kid anymore. Grew up in this business. Quite frankly, the ag, grain, fuels business, they're not as different as people think. I think people hear, ag, grains, things like that, and then they hear energy and they're like, these things are worlds apart. And I'm like, you know what? I've been in both industries. They are not worlds apart. They trade off of the same things. There's NYMEX crude oil prices. Crude trades the same way. You have differentials just like you do in grain, and a lot of it's based on, how much does it cost me to get it to where I knew. The transportation costs all have a factor into that, just like they do with your grain prices.
Absolutely. Well, Jason, any last final points you wanted to get across to our members?
Only thing I want to say is thank you for the business. CHS appreciates you. We really, really appreciate your business. I hope everybody is probably getting close to wheat durum time for harvest. I think we got to be knocking on the door. I want everybody to have a safe, bountiful harvest. I hear there's some decent crops out there. I think once we get it in the bin, I usually feel better on saying whether it was good or not. I wish everybody a safe harvest. I thank everybody again. Thank you for your business. Appreciate all you do. The Horizon Resources guys have just been fantastic for us to work with, and we really enjoy each other's company and working together on behalf of, quite frankly, that American farmer. So again, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, for taking the time. I know you're a busy man, and we carved roughly an hour out of your schedule today, so I really appreciate that. It's been a phenomenal conversation, and I hope that our members find it enlightening. To me, this was an extremely information-packed episode. I'm really excited for them to listen to it.
No, again, I want to thank you, Levi. Thanks for inviting me. My first podcast, I actually had a lot of fun here, so I appreciate you inviting me, and thank you again for the business, and thank you for inviting me.
You crushed it. Thanks again for coming on, Jason.
No problem.
Thank you for tuning in to On the Horizon. If our conversation today sparked your interest, make sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Stay connected by following @Horizon Resources Co-op on Facebook and Instagram, and explore the world of agriculture with us. We're excited to continue bringing you real conversations with Horizon Resources industry partners, member owners, and employees, discovering more about your local neighbors and community friends. Until next time, keep looking towards the horizon.
Horizon Resources, solutions for your success.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not to be used or considered as an offer or a solicitation to buy or sell commodities. Horizon Resources does not make any representation, warranty, or guarantee as to the completeness, accuracy, timeliness, or suitability of any information contained within any part of this podcast. Horizon Resources does not accept any liability for any loss or damage, including without limitation loss of profit, which may arise directly or indirectly from use or reliance on such information. Whilst the information provided has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, Horizon Resources does not attest to its accuracy or completeness. Horizon Resources reserves the right to change any source without restriction or notice. The information herein is indicative only and is subject to change.